good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are and what the clock is doing there. Settle in. Put the phone somewhere it can lie flat and forgotten. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been sitting all day, and let the room around you get a little further away. Tonight we are going to Rome. Not the Rome you are already picturing, though. That is the first thing worth clearing away, because almost everyone carries a version of this city that was assembled for them by paintings and postcards and films, and almost none of it will help you tonight. You know the picture. A young man in a pale coat, sketchbook under his arm, standing in the long grass that grows over a fallen column. Ivy tumbling down the inside of the Colosseum, thick as a hedge, with wild flowers rooted in the cracks, and a herd of goats picking their way across the arena floor. A cypress against an orange sky, a woman at a fountain with a copper jar balanced on her hip, and the water catching the light behind her, and everything, absolutely everything, still and warm and a little bit sad in a pleasant way. That picture is not invented out of nothing. Painters really did stand in that grass. Goats really did graze inside the Colosseum. There really were young men with sketchbooks and letters of introduction, working through their grand tour the way a student works through a reading list. But the picture is old by the time we are going. It belongs to a Rome that had already ended, and the people who kept selling it, in oil paint and in guidebooks, and later in photographs sold to visitors by the dozen, were selling a memory dressed up as a place. Here is what you would actually find if you stepped out of a carriage at the railway station in the spring of 1893 and walked into the city. Scaffolding. Everywhere, scaffolding. Timber poles lashed together, rising up the fronts of buildings that had not existed 5 years earlier, and would not be finished for another 5. Brick dust hanging in the air in the still hours of the morning, so fine you would taste it before you noticed it. Whole streets opened along their length, trenches cut for drains and gas, planks laid across the gaps so that people could get to their own front doors. Carts of stone, carts of lime, carts of rubble going the other way, because to build the new Rome, they were taking a great deal of the old one apart. You would find hills that had been gardens within living memory, now laid out in long, straight streets with apartment blocks 4 and 5 stories high, all of them ochre or dull rose or the grey of unrendered brick, all of them with iron balconies and shuttered windows in tidy rows. You would find some of those blocks standing entirely empty, not ruined, not old, new and empty, with the plaster still pale and the window frames never once painted, because the men who built them had been building for a boom that stopped. You would find the river being walled, not tidied, not embanked in the gentle sense, but walled in great pale blocks of travertine, high enough that from the street you could no longer see the water at all. Along the banks where that wall was going up, there had been workshops and boat sheds and mills that floated on the current itself, and rows of low houses whose back doors opened onto mud and moored boats. Those were gone, or going, and the people who had lived and worked in them were somewhere else now, and the somewhere else is part of our story. And you would find a city that had been the capital of a country for only about 20 years, and was not remotely used to the job. That last point is the one to hold on to, because everything else grows out of it. It is easy to think of Rome as permanent, as the place that has always been the center of whatever was happening. But the Italy we know, the single country from the Alps down to Sicily, was assembled piece by piece across the middle of the 19th century, and Rome was one of the last pieces to be fitted. Until 1870, it was ruled by the Pope, as it had been for something like 1,000 years, and it was not a capital in the modern sense at all. It was a city of churches, of pilgrims, of great families, of enormous religious institutions, of a small artisan economy that fed and clothed and furnished all of that, and of a great deal of open ground inside its own ancient walls where sheep grazed and vines grew. And nothing much had happened for centuries. Then, in one September, that ended. Italian troops came through the wall near one of the gates. The papal government gave way, and within a few years, Rome was the capital of a modern state that needed ministries, archives, barracks, banks, a parliament, and tens of thousands of clerks to fill them all. Those clerks needed somewhere to live. So did the builders who built the places they lived in, and the carters who hauled the stone, and the bakers who fed the carters. Within 20 years, the population had swelled by something close to half again. The city grew outward and upward faster than it had grown in any century since antiquity, and it did all of that on speculation and borrowed money. And then, in the early 1890s, a great deal of that borrowed money turned out not to exist in the way people had thought it did. Banks failed. Building sites stopped mid-course. Men who had come to Rome for the wages of a bricklayer found there were no more walls to lay. So the Rome we are walking into tonight is not sleepy, and it is not a museum. It is a construction site with a hangover. It is loud. It is dusty. It is anxious about money, in the particular way a place is anxious when the good years have just ended, and nobody has admitted it out loud yet. It has electric light in a few streets, and oil lamps in most rooms. It has trams, and it has water carried up 4 flights of stairs by hand. It has a government that considers itself modern, and a church that has not recognized that government at all, and it has ordinary people threading their way between those two things every single day, keeping the feast days and paying the taxes and saying as little as possible about either. And that is where you come in, because we are not going to spend tonight with a diplomat or an archaeologist or a visiting poet with letters of credit and a room at a good hotel. Their Rome is very well documented, and frankly, their Rome is not very interesting, because they got to leave. You are going to be somebody who stayed, somebody with 2 rented rooms at the top of a staircase in a quarter on the west bank of the river, in a building older than anyone can accurately say, in a neighborhood that the new city has not yet reached and has not yet decided what to do with. You will get up before it is light. You will carry water. You will count coins into a tin and make a week fit inside them. You will cross the river to buy food and cross back with it. You will work with your hands for hours at a task nobody will ever write down as work. And then in the evening, you will go out into the street with everyone else you know and sit on a chair on the pavement while the light goes, because that is what the evening is for. by the time we are done, you will know what bread cost, and what a day of skilled labor paid, and what the gap between those two numbers meant on a Thursday when the rent was due on Saturday. You will know which parts of a butchered animal ended up on your table, and which ended up across the river, and why. You will know what it took to keep 4 people in clean shirts without a single machine of any kind in the building. You will know why the shutters got closed at dusk in certain months, and what people believed about the air, and what they were beginning to believe instead. None of that is a tragedy, and I am not going to serve it to you as one. This is a working life, competently lived, by somebody who is good at it. There is skill in nearly every hour of the day we are about to spend together, and a great deal of it is skill that was never called skill by anyone in a position to write it down. That is worth noticing as we go. We will notice it. But first, 2 small things. If you find this useful for getting to sleep, or if you simply like the company, it does help enormously if you subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means the next one of these finds you without you having to go looking. And if you are the sort who is still awake at the end, or if you drift off in the market and come back somewhere near the river, tell me in the comments where you are and what the clock says there. I always read them, and it is a genuinely strange and lovely thing to see this narration going out into so many different hours of so many different nights at once. Now, turn the light down or off. Get the pillow into the shape it needs to be. There is nothing left tonight that requires you to be awake for it, and nothing in what follows that you need to hold on to. If you lose the thread, let it go. It will still be here. Let the room go soft. Let the traffic outside, or the wind, or the quiet, become something happening a long way off. And let us go back past the cars, and the cameras, and the queues, past the wars, past the turn of the century, back to a spring morning in the year 1893, on the west bank of the Tiber, in a narrow street where the buildings lean close enough at the top that you can see only a strip of sky between them, and where the first bell of the morning is about to ring from a tower 3 streets away. You are already there. You are only just about to wake up. The bell reaches you before you are properly awake. It is not a large bell, and it is not a beautiful one. It is a cracked, flat, workaday sound from a church you have never once been inside, 3 streets over, and it rings at 4:30 because a sacristan there has rung it at 4:30 every morning of your adult life. You do not hear it so much as register that it has stopped. Then the second one, further off, deeper, from the other direction. Then, faintly, a third, so distant it might be across the river entirely. Rome in this year has hundreds of churches, and most of them keep their own time. And the effect at this hour is not a chorus, but an argument, a slow, scattered disagreement about what o'clock it is, moving across the rooftops from east to west as the light comes. You are lying on your side facing the wall. The wall is cold. It is always cold, even in June, because the building has stone walls, a full arm's length thick at the base, and small windows, and it was built to keep summer out, which it does, and to keep winter out, which it does not. Below the bells, closer, the sound that actually wakes people in this quarter. Iron-shod wheels on basalt. The paving stones here are cut squares of black volcanic rock, laid in fans, and a cart crossing them at walking pace makes a noise like a slow avalanche of crockery. That will be the first of the produce carts coming in from the fields south of the city, or a water cellar, or a man taking charcoal somewhere. By 6 there will be a dozen of them, and you will have stopped hearing any of it. And under everything, the smell. Damp stone, first of all, because the river is 400 paces away, and this whole quarter sits low and wet and always has. Then wood smoke, faint, somebody's fire already lit. Then the sourness of the drain in the courtyard. Then, cutting through, from the ground floor of the building opposite, the smell of a bread oven that has been burning since 2 in the morning. You are 34 years old. You were born in this quarter, 4 streets from where you are lying, in a year when the man who governed this city was a pope and not a king, and when the idea that Rome might be the capital of a country called Italy was the sort of thing men said quietly in wine shops and did not write down. You have never lived more than half a mile from where you were born. You have crossed the river perhaps 4,000 times and left the city itself possibly 9. All of them to visit a cousin in the hills. All of them in a cart. You are married to a cabinet maker. He is asleep beside you, on his back, one forearm over his eyes, as though the dark were too bright. And he will wake in about 20 minutes, without needing to be woken, because his body has been getting up at 5 for 22 years, and does not require your assistance. He is 40. He does chairs, mostly, and repairs, and in a good month, he does the interior fittings for someone else's shop counter. He works for a master in a yard off a street near the river, 6 days a week, with a break in the middle of the day, long enough to come home and eat and sleep for 20 minutes sitting upright. You have 3 living children. The eldest is a boy of 11, then a girl of 8, then the small one, 3, who is asleep at this moment across the foot of your own bed, because she came in at some point in the night, and you did not have the strength to argue about it. There is a 4th child you carried, and there is a 5th who lived 11 months, and neither of those facts is a wound you are carrying around this particular morning. They are simply part of the arithmetic of a woman of your age and station in this city, and everyone you know has the same sort of arithmetic, and it is not discussed at the fountain. You have 2 rooms. That is the whole of it, and it is worth being precise about, because the shape of the rooms is the shape of your entire day. There is this room, which has the bed in it, and a chest, and a chair, and 2 hooks on the back of the door, and a window, and there is the other room, which is slightly larger, and has the hearth, and the table, and the shelf with the copper on it, and the mattress the 2 older children sleep on, and the second window, which is the good one, because it faces the street and gets light for about 5 hours in the middle of the day. Both rooms are up 4 flights. The staircase is stone, worn into a shallow curve in the middle of each step by something like 300 years of feet, and it turns twice, and there is no lamp on it at any point, ever. You could go up and down it blindfolded, and in a sense you frequently do, because in December you are climbing it at 6 in the evening in total darkness, with a basket on one hip and a child's hand in the other, and you have never once fallen. For these 2 rooms, and for the right to use the courtyard below, and the water in it, you pay rent to a man who does not live in this quarter, and whom you have met twice. He is not the owner. He collects for the owner. He comes on a Saturday, in a coat that is better than any coat on this street, and he is not cruel about it, and he is not kind about it either. He simply arrives and expects the money to be there, and it is generally there, and on the 2 occasions in the last 4 years, when it has not been there entirely, an arrangement was arrived, and that cost you more in the end than the missing amount. Down in the courtyard, which you cannot see from here but can hear, a door has just opened. The courtyard is a shaft, essentially. 4 walls of building around a paved square about the size of a large room, with a drain in the middle, a stone basin against one wall, and lines of washing crossing it at 3 different heights, so that on a Monday the sky is mostly other people's sheets. 6 families use it. You know the sound of every single door that opens onto it, and you know, without thinking about it, that the one that has just opened belongs to the widow on the ground floor at the back, who is up before you every day of the year, and who will be at the basin now, and who will still be somewhere in the courtyard in an hour when you come down, and who will tell you something about somebody before you have got the water in. There is one window in this room, and it faces a wall. Not a distant wall. A wall about 3.5 arms lengths away, the flank of the building opposite, which is a little taller than this one. If you lean out and look up, you get the strip of sky. If you lean out and look down, you get the courtyard. What you do not get at any hour of any day in any season is direct sun in this room, which is why the bed is in here, and why you do your clothes work in the other room by the street window, and why the wall behind your head is cold in June. Now, consider the day that is waiting. The fire has to be lit, which means the charcoal has to be got at, which means you have to know how much charcoal is left, and you do, to within about a day. Water has to be carried up, and that is 4 flights, and it will need doing more than once. Bread has to be bought while it is still hot enough to be worth what it costs. The children have to be fed and got out of the door. Your husband has to be got out of the door before them. There is a basket to be taken across the river to the market, and a decision to be made in front of the vegetable stalls that will not feel like a decision at all, but will be one, because you have a fixed number of coins in a tin and 11 days until the end of the week's arrangement with the shop on the corner. There is a wash to be done in that courtyard basin, with the widow talking at you. There is a bundle of piecework sitting on the chest at this moment, brought home from a workshop, which has to go back finished, and which is worth doing only if you can get 2 hours of good window light at it. There is a child to be walked somewhere. There is a meal at midday and another at night. There is a shirt with a torn shoulder seam that has been waiting 9 days, and that will be finished tonight by lamplight, because tomorrow it is needed. None of that is unusual. All of it is today, and all of it was yesterday. And here is the thing I want to plant now before you get up, because it will be underneath everything that follows. There is a version of this city that has been sold very effectively for about 200 years, in which Rome in the 1890s is a beautiful, drowsy, half-abandoned museum, a place of broken columns with grass growing out of them, a place where nothing much happens, where a foreign visitor with a sketchbook can sit all afternoon in a piazza and be undisturbed, where the past is lying about in the streets like furniture nobody wanted, and where the living inhabitants are picturesque background figures in somebody else's watercolor. That version is a lie, and it is not even a very old lie. The Rome you are waking up in is a construction site. It is loud, it is dusty, it is scaffolded. It is full of men who arrived from other provinces in the last decade and speak in accents your grandmother would not have recognized. Whole districts of it did not exist when you were a girl. Whole districts of it that did exist have been knocked flat. There are enormous new white government buildings going up with columns on them. And there are streets of speculative apartment blocks, standing 5 stories tall and completely empty, with weeds in the ground floor doorways, because the money that was building them ran out with a crash you felt in this kitchen. This is not a sleepy town. This is a capital city, 23 years old, still raw at the joins, being torn open and rebuilt around the people who already lived here. You are one of the people who already lived here. Your husband has just moved his arm off his eyes. He does not get up yet. He lies there for a moment with his eyes open, looking at the ceiling, which is stained brown in one corner from a leak that the landlord has been promising to see about since the winter before last. Then he swings his legs down and sits on the edge of the mattress with his hands on his knees. And you let him sit, because you know what the first minute of the morning is worth to a man who spends 11 hours a day standing at a bench. While he sits, let us take the thing you have just been told and put a date on it, because the date is the whole story. Rome became the capital of Italy in 1870. That is not a distant fact for you. That is inside your own memory. You were a child, 11 years old, and you remember the artillery, and you remember the days afterwards when nobody was certain what would happen next, and you remember your mother deciding that the safest thing was to stay indoors and say nothing to anybody about anything. Before that, Rome had been ruled by the Pope, not as a spiritual matter, but as an ordinary government with a treasury and a customs house and a police force, and it had been ruled that way for a very long time indeed. Then, in the space of a single autumn, it stopped being the capital of a small papal state of a few 100,000 people, and started being the capital of a kingdom of nearly 30 million. Think about what that actually requires. A kingdom of 30 million needs ministries. It needs a war office, and a treasury, and a post office, and an interior ministry, and a foreign ministry. And each of those needs a building, and each of those buildings needs several hundred clerks, and each of those clerks needs somewhere to live, and a place to eat lunch, and a tram to carry him there, and a school for his children. None of that existed in Rome in 1870. The city that the new government inherited had about 220,000 people in it, a great many of them living much as you live now, in old quarters of narrow lanes, and it had almost no modern infrastructure of any kind. It had monasteries, it had convents, it had enormous religious institutions, holding enormous quantities of land inside the walls, gardens and vineyards, and orchards behind high walls in the middle of the city, so that from a high window you could look out over Rome and see green, The new state took a great deal of that land. It suppressed religious houses and sold or converted their property, and it turned convents into barracks and offices and schools, and it opened the walled gardens to the builders. And then, through the 1880s, Rome had a building boom of a kind it had not seen since the emperors. You watched it happen. Everybody watched it happen. Money came in from banks in Turin and Genoa, and from further away than that, and speculators bought up the old gardens and threw up apartment blocks on them as fast as bricks could be carted. Whole new quarters came out of the ground in a few years. Streets of tall, regular buildings with plaster fronts and iron balconies, all of them meant for the clerks and the officers and the shopkeepers of the new capital. The wages were good if you were in the building trades. Men came in from the countryside around Rome and from further off, from the marches, from Abruzzo, from the south, and they came because there was work, and the population of the city went up by something like half in 20 years. And then, at the end of the 1880s, the money stopped. It stopped for reasons that had almost nothing to do with Rome. A trade quarrel with France closed off markets. Credit tightened. The banks that had lent so freely against half-built property discovered that the property was worth less than the loans, and several of them came apart. And there was a scandal about note-issuing banks that ran all the way up into the government, and is still, in this spring of 1893, being uncovered piece by piece in the newspapers your husband reads at the workshop. What that meant on the ground here was simple and brutal in the ordinary economic sense. The scaffolding came down off buildings that were not finished. The carts stopped. Men who had come here for work stood about in the mornings by the bridges, waiting for a foreman who did not arrive. You can walk 20 minutes from this room and see the result. Streets laid out properly, curbstones in, gas lamps installed, doorways framed in good travertine, and behind the doorways nothing but bare brick and rubble, and the smell of damp lime. Buildings with roofs and no floors. Buildings with floors and no roofs. Grass growing in the entrance halls of apartment houses that were designed for families who never came, because the boom that was supposed to fill them was made of borrowed money, and the borrowing ended. So when a visitor tells you that Rome is romantic and unchanging, you have a very particular reason to find that funny. Nothing in your adult life has been unchanging. The street your aunt lived in is gone. The market she used is gone. Half the men in your quarter were not born in this city, and neither were their wives. There is a second thing going on underneath all this, and it is the one that reaches furthest into a kitchen like yours. Rome, in 1893, is two cities occupying the same streets, and they are not on speaking terms. There is the new Italy, the ministries, the prefecture, the army, the tricolour, the king in the Quirinal palace, the newspapers that print parliamentary debates, the state schools, the tax collector, the conscription lists, and there is the old Rome of the Church, which has not accepted any of it. The Pope has not set foot outside the Vatican since 1870. He calls himself a prisoner. He has forbidden faithful Catholics to vote in national elections or to stand for Parliament. And a great many of the old Roman families obey that instruction. Shut their palace gates, refuse to attend anything the court does, and consider the whole kingdom, a temporary occupation that God will eventually correct. 2 governments, in effect. 2 calendars. 2 sets of holidays. 2 sets of newspapers, each of which describes a different country. And you live at the point where both of them touch the ground. It reaches you in small, constant, practical decisions. Which feast days do you keep? The parish keeps its own, and the parish is where your children were baptized, and where your mother is remembered, and where the priest knows your name and knows exactly how much you gave last year, and could, if he chose, be useful to you when a family is in difficulty. The state keeps its own. The anniversary of the Constitution, the King's celebrations, the 20th of September, which commemorates the very day the artillery came through the wall, and which the Church regards as a day of mourning. On the 20th of September, there are flags on the government buildings, and a band somewhere, and the ministries close. And in your quarter, a good many shutters stay closed too. And it is understood without anyone saying it aloud, whose shutters and why. It reaches you in which paper comes into the house. Your husband is a cabinet maker in a small workshop, and he is not a political man. But the workshop takes a paper, and the paper it takes tells you a great deal about the workshop. One kind of paper prints the bank scandal in enormous type and asks how many deputies took money. Another kind prints the Pope's address to pilgrims and refers to the government as a usurpation. A third is a cheap sheet with crime stories and the price of flour. And honestly, that one is the most useful. It reaches you in processions. When the Corpus Christi procession goes through, and the balconies along the route are hung with cloth, and everyone kneels as it passes, you kneel, and so does the woman on the second floor, whose son is a clerk in the treasury, and who therefore draws his bread from the very state the procession is quietly protesting against. Nobody mentions the contradiction. Everybody manages it. Managing it is one of the ordinary domestic skills of a Roman woman in the 1890s, the way managing a charcoal fire is, and nobody writes it down anywhere, and it will not appear in any history of the period as work. But it is work, and you do it every week, and it reaches you, most of all, through money and paper. The parish charity is real, and it functions, and it will help a family that has fallen behind. And it functions best for families that are known and observed and regular in attendance. The state also touches you through the tax on milled grain in earlier years, through duties at the city gates on wine and meat and oil coming in, through school and conscription, and the endless small stamped documents that a modern government generates, and that a woman who cannot read confidently must have read to her by somebody she trusts. 2 systems, each of which wants your loyalty, neither of which will feed you on their own. Enough. The room is getting lighter at the edge of the shutter, and there is a fire to be got going. You kneel at the hearth, which is not a hearth so much as a raised brick shelf with 2 hollows in it for charcoal, and you rake yesterday's ash to one side and set the kindling. The charcoal is in a sack under the shelf, and there is less of it than you would like. You blow carefully from low down until the first sticks catch, and the smell of it fills the room in that particular way that means the day has properly started. Your husband is pulling on his boots. Your eldest is awake, lying still, watching the ceiling exactly the way her father was 5 minutes ago. The copper vessels are by the door where you left them last night, and they are empty. and they will not fill themselves. Everything else, the whole enormous quarrel between the kingdom and the church, the ruined banks, the empty apartment houses standing in their weeds on the far side of the river, all of it will still be there in an hour. The water will not. You take the 2 copper vessels by their handles, 1 in each hand, and you go down, 4 flights, and the stairwell has no window until the second landing. So the first part of the descent is done by memory and by the feel of the wall under your left knuckles. The steps are worn into shallow dishes in the middle, where 1.5 centuries of feet have come down them. You know which one is cracked at the outer edge, and you put your weight to the inside of it without thinking about it, the way you would step over a sleeping cat. On the second landing, there is light, grey and thin, coming through a small square opening with no glass in it, and you can smell the courtyard before you can see it. Wet stone. Yesterday's cooking. Somewhere below, a door on a leather hinge, opening and closing. The courtyard has a well head in the corner, but nobody has drawn from that well in living memory, and the mouth of it has been boarded over and used as a place to stand things. Your water comes from the street, out through the passage, under the arch, and there it is, 40 paces from your door. A stone basin on the corner where 2 lanes meet, with a spout above it, and the water coming out of that spout without pause, day and night, winter and summer, whether anyone is there to catch it or not. That constancy is the thing to understand first. The fountain is not turned on. There is no tap. The water simply arrives continuously, at a rate that has not changed appreciably since the pipe was laid, and the surplus runs off the lip of the basin and down a gutter and away toward the river. To a modern eye, that looks like waste on a spectacular scale. To the men who built the system, it was the entire point, because a fountain that runs constantly cannot be hoarded, cannot be rationed by a keyholder, and cannot go stale. Here is where the water is coming from, and it is worth slowing down for, because you are standing at the working end of one of the oldest continuously functioning pieces of engineering in Europe. The ancient city was supplied by aqueducts, 11 of them at the height, bringing water down from the hills to the east and southeast by gravity along channels that ran sometimes underground, sometimes on those long files of brick arches you can still see marching across the open country outside the walls. When the empire came apart, most of those channels failed or were cut, and for something like 1,000 years, Rome drank from the river and from wells, and the population shrank to a fraction of what it had been, and huddled in the low ground of the bend of the Tiber, where the water table was near the surface. Then, from the 15th century onward, popes rebuilt them, not all of them, and not exactly on the old courses, but 3 principal lines were brought back into service across roughly 150 years, and each one was announced by a great show fountain at its terminus, the kind tourists photograph, and then by a scattering of smaller basins through the streets it passed. That was the deal, and it was made explicit at the time. The grand terminal fountain glorified the Pope who paid for it. The little corner basins, unsigned and unadmired, actually watered the city. Your basin is one of those. It has a carved shield on the face of it, worn nearly smooth, and neither you nor anyone you know could say with confidence whose arms they are. Now, The new city has piped water in the streets going up beyond the walls, in the tall speculative apartment blocks with their stucco fronts and their iron balconies. There are buildings with a supply brought up to the upper floors, and a sink in the kitchen with a brass tap over it, and in the better ones, a bathroom of some description. This is not exotic. It exists. It is being installed. It is advertised in the letting notices. It is simply not here, in a building of this age, in this quarter, on this lane. And it will not be here for a long while yet, because retrofitting a pipe and a pump into a 4-story block that was patched together out of 2 older houses is expensive, and the landlord has no reason on earth to do it while you keep carrying the water up yourself for nothing. That is the whole economics of it. The labor is free because it is yours. 2 vessels, full, is somewhere around 30 or 40 pounds of weight going up 4 flights. You will make that trip 3 times before midday, and perhaps twice more in the afternoon, depending on whether it is a wash day. And you have done it so many thousands of times that you no longer think of it as a task with a beginning and an end. It is simply a condition of the day, like the stairs themselves. There are 5 women at the fountain ahead of you, and the queue is not a queue in any orderly sense. It is a loose gathering with an understood order that everybody keeps track of without stating it. The woman from the ground floor of the yellow house is filling, and behind her is the one whose husband works the marble yard. And behind her, 2 sisters who share rooms with their mother, and a girl of about 11 with a single small jug, who is being allowed to go ahead of everyone because she is small and because her mother is not well this week. And this is the other thing the fountain does, which no engineer designed and no pope paid for. It is where the quarter finds out what has happened. Standing here for the 8 or 10 minutes it takes to reach the spout, you learn that the family on the 3rd floor of the corner house is going to the country to the wife's brother because there is no work. That a man was taken up by the police in the small hours near the bridge, and nobody is sure why. That the price of oil has gone up again at one shop, but not at the other. And which one? That the eldest daughter of the fruit seller is to be married, and to whom and what his people do, and what is thought about it. You learn who is ill. You learn who is behind with the rent, which is information handled carefully and never said directly, only implied. Because everyone here has been behind with the rent. None of this is idle. Every item of it is usable. Knowing which shop has not raised its oil saves you actual money this week. Knowing that a family is leaving means 2 rooms are coming free, and you know it before the notice goes up. Knowing that a woman is ill means you send your 2nd child round with a bowl of something, which is not only kindness, it is deposit paid into an account you may need to draw on yourself in November. The women who miss the fountain, because they have a girl to send instead, are the women who fall out of the quarters and knowledge. It happens. It is not an advantage. Your turn. You set the first vessel under the spout, and the sound changes as it fills, going from a hollow ringing to a deeper and deeper note, and you know from the pitch alone when to swap it out without looking. The water is cold enough to ache in the wrist bones. It is also clean, genuinely clean, cleaner than a great deal of what is drunk in northern cities out of pipes at this same moment, because it has come down from limestone hills through a covered channel and has not sat anywhere. Up the 4 flights, one hand on the wall at the turn, and set them on the shelf by the shelf hearth. Then out again, and this time to the baker's, because the bread has to be got warm, or it is not worth getting. The bread is the second fixed point of the morning. You buy it daily, not weekly, because there is no way to keep it, and you buy the ordinary loaf, the pale brown one, dense, with a hard crust and an open crumb, which is baked from a flour that has had some, but not all of the bran taken out of it. It is sold by weight. You buy a little over 2 pounds of it for the household, and it will be gone by tomorrow, most of it eaten with almost nothing on it, and the last of it will not be thrown away under any circumstances. Stale bread goes into soup to thicken it, gets soaked and pressed into a kind of savoury pudding with whatever is left of a vegetable. Gets grated over pasta in place of cheese when there is no cheese. Gets crumbed and fried in a spoonful of oil for the children. There is a whole grammar of 2nd day and 3rd day bread, and every woman in the queue knows all of it. Across the river, in the households with the piped water and the brass taps, the bread on the table in the morning is white, milled finer, sometimes enriched, sometimes shaped into small individual rolls, and it costs meaningfully more per pound, and the difference in that flour is more or less the difference between the 2 cities you are living in simultaneously. Nobody eats bread as a matter of taste at your end. It is the base of the whole diet. It is a substantial share of the calories that get 4 people and a small one through a working day. Back up. The fire is going properly now, and the water is on, and you make the coffee. The coffee is not coffee, or rather, it is coffee stretched to the edge of what the word can bear. What is actually in the pot is roasted chicory root, ground, with some proportion of true coffee added according to what the week has allowed. And this week the proportion is not generous. It comes out very dark and slightly bitter in a flat, earthy way that real coffee is not bitter, and it is drunk hot and without milk and with sugar, if there is sugar. Your husband takes his standing with a piece of the bread in about 90 seconds. The children eat standing too, or perched on the edge of the bed, because there is one table and it has the work of the day on it already. Bread, a smear of oil. The eldest is given the crust because she likes it. Then he takes his cap and his tool roll and the tin with his midday food in it. And he has gone down the stairs, and you hear his particular tread all the way to the arch, and you find, without having decided to, that you are already thinking about the second trip to the fountain, and about the fact that the woman from the yellow house said the oil is unchanged at the shop by the church, and that you should go there and not to the other one. The tin is on the shelf above the bed, behind the small painted plate that came from your mother, and it holds the whole week. You take it down before you do anything else, because the plan for the day has to be made against what is actually in it, and not against what you would like to be in it. The tin was originally for something else, biscuits perhaps, and the lid no longer fits properly, and there is a soft grey ring worn into the paint where your thumb goes. Inside there are coins, and there is a folded scrap of paper with 4 numbers on it that only you can read. You count, not because you have forgotten, because you have not forgotten. You know within a few centesimi what is in that tin at any hour of any day of the week, the way a person knows how many steps are on their own stairs. You count because counting is the ritual that turns a vague worry into a fixed quantity you can work with. And because your mother counted, and because a woman who does not count is a woman who finds out on a Thursday. So, here is the arithmetic of your life, and it is worth going slowly through it, because the numbers are the story. Everything else in this day, every choice about oil and chicory, and whether the eldest gets shoes before winter, sits on top of this. Your husband is a cabinet maker with a trade in his hands, which puts him above a day labourer and well below a clerk. In Rome, in these years, a skilled man in the building and furnishing trades earns something in the neighbourhood of 3.5 to 4 lire for a full day's work. More in the long light of summer when the working day stretches. Less when it does not. Call it 4 lire on a good day. He does not work every day. Nobody in the building trades works every day. There is weather, and there is the far more serious matter of whether there is work at all, which in Rome at the start of the 1890s has become a live and frightening question. Reckon it honestly across a month, and you are living on something like 80 to 90 lire, with good months higher and bad months considerably lower, and the bad months arriving without warning. Out of that, before anything else, comes the rent. 2 rooms, 4 flights up, 1 window that faces the courtyard, in a building that was old when your grandmother was a girl, around 20 lire a month, paid to a man who does not own the building, but collects for someone who does, and who has never been seen in the courtyard in your lifetime. 20 lire out of 85. Call it a quarter of everything that comes in, gone before the first loaf. Hold that number. A quarter. It is the single most important figure in your life, and it is the one that has moved most in the 20 years you have been paying attention. This is the point where it is worth stepping back from the tin and looking at the city, because your rent is not a private misfortune. It is the direct consequence of what happened to Rome after 1870. When the capital moved here, it did not arrive alone. A capital is not a flag on a building. A capital is ministries, and ministries are clerks, and clerks are men with families who need somewhere to live. And they came from Turin and Florence and Naples and every province in the kingdom, thousands upon thousands of them, into a city that had perhaps 200,000 people in it, and no housing to spare. Within 20 years, the population had risen by well over half again. All those people needed rooms. They needed them immediately. What follows from that is the simplest and oldest arithmetic there is. When the number of people looking for rooms rises faster than the number of rooms, the price of a room rises, and it keeps rising until either building catches up or people stop coming. Building did try to catch up. That was the fever of the 1880s. The scaffolding, the new streets driven through, the speculators buying land in the fields outside the old walls and borrowing against it. And when that collapsed at the start of this decade, the half-finished blocks stopped being built, and the rooms in them stopped arriving, and the pressure came straight back down onto old buildings like yours. So the price of your 2 rooms has climbed steadily across your adult life. and your husband's daily rate has not. A skilled wage in the trades is not very different now from what it was when you married, allowing for the fact that a good year and a bad year look nothing alike. Rent has gone up. Wages have gone sideways. That gap is not a feeling. It is a measurable thing, and it is the reason the family in the rooms below yours has 5 people, where it used to have 4, and the reason 2 brothers you knew as boys now sleep in a workshop, rather than pay for a room of their own. Nobody in the ministries did this to you deliberately. That is almost the harder part to hold. It was simply what happened when a small ecclesiastical city was told, in the space of a few years, to become the seat of a nation. Back to the tin, because the rent is only the beginning. After rent, bread. Bread is the anchor of the whole budget, and its price is the number every woman in the quarter knows to the centesimo. Reckon roughly half a lira for a kilogram, moving up and down with the harvest, and with the duty on grain. And reckon that your household of 4 and a bit eats a very great deal of it. Bread alone will take something like 1/5 of everything that comes in. Rent and bread together, before oil, before wine, before charcoal, before a single artichoke or a single length of thread, are already eating close to half. Then oil, which is not a garnish but a fuel, and which you buy by the small measure rather than the large, because the large measure costs less per unit, and you do not have the money to take advantage of that. A fact that is worth saying out loud because it is one of the quiet cruelties of being poor. Everything is dearer when you buy it in the quantities you can afford. Then wine, bought by the flask from the cellar shop at the corner, cheap and rough and watered for the children, which is not indulgence but calories and safety, in a city where you would not drink from every source without thinking. Then charcoal for the fire, in small paper twists. Then the things that are not weekly, but that arrive anyway. Thread, soap, a new sole on a boot, the tax on salt, which you pay without ever seeing a collector because it is folded into the price. The doctor, if it comes to that. The parish, at intervals, in ways that are not compulsory and are not optional either. What is left over at the end of that arithmetic, in a good month, is a small amount that you put back into the tin and do not touch. In a bad month, there is nothing left over, and the tin goes the other way. And this is where the slate comes in. Almost nothing at your end of the city is bought with money at the moment of the transaction. It is bought against a chalk mark. The woman at the shop by the church keeps a slate behind the counter, and on it are the names of about 30 households in these streets, and against each name a column of marks that goes up through the week and comes down on Saturday evening when the wages arrive. She does not write amounts. She writes marks, and both of you know what each mark stands for, and neither of you has ever needed to say so. This system is not charity, and it is not kindness, though there is some kindness in it. It is credit, extended by a woman who has very little herself, to families whose ability to pay depends entirely on whether men she has never met decide there is work this week. She carries the risk. She sets the price a little higher than the shop on the main road to cover it. And everyone understands this, and nobody complains, because the shop on the main road will not chalk anything for anyone. The delicate part is Saturday. If you can clear the slate, you clear it, and you say almost nothing, and she wipes it with a cloth. and there is a small silence that is both of you being pleased. If you cannot clear it, there is a conversation, and the conversation has rules as fixed as any drawing room etiquette in any grand house across the river. You do not explain at length, because a long explanation sounds like a story. You say that the work was short this week, and you will bring the rest on the following Saturday. You pay something, even if it is small, because paying something is the whole difference between a woman in temporary difficulty and a woman who has begun to slide. She says that is fine, and she does not wipe the slate, and she serves you on Monday exactly as she served you on Friday, and that is the transaction complete. What is being managed there, on both sides, is not money. It is standing. You are worth extending to. That judgment is made about you continuously, by the shopkeeper, by the woman who lends the good iron, by the man who collects the rent, and it is made on evidence you supply daily in small quantities, and you have never in your life been able to stop supplying it. Your husband has almost no idea of any of this. He knows what he earns, and he hands over most of it, and he knows the rent is due, the rest of the structure, the marks on the slate, the difference between the two oil shops, the calculation about whether to buy the smaller measure now or wait until Saturday and buy larger, the running estimate of how many days of bread are standing between this family and real trouble. All of that lives in your head and nowhere else. There is no ledger. There is a scrap of paper with 4 numbers on it that would mean nothing to anyone who found it. You put the coins for today into your palm, and the rest back into the tin, and the tin back behind the painted plate. The basket is on its hook by the door, the flat one with the broken corner that you have been meaning to have rewoven for 2 years. You take it down. The list is not written anywhere. It is in your head, in order, arranged by the route you will walk and the cues you expect, with 2 alternatives held ready in case the price at the first stall is wrong. You call to the eldest to mind the small one, and you go down the 4 flights into the light. The street at this hour smells of wet stone and charcoal smoke, and from somewhere below, the particular sourness of a wine cellar being swilled out with water. You go left at the bottom of the stairs, past the man who repairs chairs, sitting already in his doorway, with a bundle of rush across his knees, and down toward the bridge. The river is on your right, low this time of year, a green-brown ribbon well below the level of the new walls. You do not look at it much. Nobody does anymore. On the bridge, the crowd thickens. Women with baskets, most of them, going the same direction you are, and coming the other way. A boy driving 4 goats toward some courtyard on your side of the water, and a handcart with 1 wheel that shrieks at every turn, so that everyone within 30 paces knows he is coming. The cart is stacked with crates of something green, and the boy pushing it is younger than your eldest. Then the streets narrow, and the noise arrives all at once. Campo de Fiori in the morning does not sound like one thing. It sounds like 40 things layered badly. The sellers call, and each of them has a pattern, a shape of sound repeated every 20 seconds or so, and none of the patterns agree with each other. The woman with the chicory sings hers on 2 notes going down. The fishmonger barks his flat and short. There is a man selling lupins from a barrel who has 1 long word that you have heard 4 days a week for 11 years, and could not spell if someone paid you. Under all of it, the sound of the square itself. Boots on stone, crates dropped, water sloshed out of a bucket across the paving. A dog, 100 conversations conducted at the volume required to be heard over the other 99. The awnings are up, canvas mostly, some of it striped, most of it a colour that used to be something and is now the colour of old canvas, strung on poles at whatever height the seller could manage and patched wherever the sun found a way through. Under them, the light goes yellow and cool at the same time, and everything looks slightly better than it is, which is the point. You know what is here before you arrive. That is worth saying plainly, because the picture people have of a market is a woman wandering among abundance, deciding. There is no wandering. It is spring, and spring in Rome means what it has always meant. Artichokes, first and above all, piled in their hundreds, stalks up, the tight purple-green kind, grown out in the sandy ground toward the coast, and you can buy them by the piece or by the dozen. And the dozen is always the better price if you have the money to reach for a dozen, which some weeks you do not. Broad beans still in the pod, sold by weight, and the pods are half the weight, and everybody knows it, and the price accounts for it. Peas, expensive and brief. Chicory in great wet heaps, the wild sort and the cultivated sort at different prices. Puntarelle, which wants an hour of somebody's work with a knife before it becomes food. Lettuce. Onions, always. Garlic in braids. There are lemons from the south, and oranges near the end of their season going soft and cheap. There is nothing you would call exotic. The great fruits of a Roman summer, the tomatoes and peppers and courgettes that will fill this square from June onward, are not here in April, in any quantity you can afford. And the ones you can see, forced early and brought up from somewhere warm, carry a price that tells you exactly who they are for. Friday there is salt cod, stacked in dry grey boards that have to be soaked for 2 days before they turn into anything, and eels sometimes, and small fish of the kind that are fried whole and eaten bones and all. Fresh sea fish comes up from the coast on the railway now, which is new enough in living memory that the older women still mention it, and it arrives in ice, and it is priced accordingly. Meat is a different matter, and it is here that the market makes its social arrangement most visible. There is a ladder. At the top of it is the loin, the leg, the good cuts of veal that go, without ever passing through this square at all, to the butchers who serve the new apartment districts across the river. The streets built in the last 15 years, with high ceilings and interior water, and doorkeepers in the hall. A clerk in a ministry with a wife and 2 children eats a piece of roasted veal on Sunday. That is what the position purchases. Below that, the cheaper joints, the shoulder, the neck, boiled long, and at the bottom, which is where you shop, the 5th quarter. That is the name for it, and it is exact. The animal is divided into 4 quarters that are sold as meat, and then there is everything else. Liver, lungs, heart, tripe, tail, sweetbreads, the parts of the head. In this city, those things are not scraps thrown out. They are a cuisine. Oxtail cooked for 4 hours with celery until the meat comes off in ropes. Tripe with mint and cheese. Corotella, the lights and liver of a young lamb, done fast in a pan with artichokes, because both are in season at once and always have been. The men who work in the slaughterhouse out past the Testaxio Hill take part of their pay in these cuts. That is where the tradition comes from, at bottom. And the tradition is not romantic. It is what happened when the good meat went one direction, and the men who did the killing went another. And the women in their kitchens turned the leftovers into something that 4 hours of patience makes worth eating. You will buy oxtail today if the price is what you think it is, because it will feed 5 people twice, and because your husband likes it, and because it can sit on the corner of the fire doing nothing that requires you, while you do 6 other things. Now, the haggling. An outsider watching this square would say the prices here are negotiated. They are not, quite. There is a real price, which the seller knows, and you know, and there is an opening price, which is above it, and there is a floor, which is below it, and which the seller will not go under, because he cannot. What happens between you is not a contest to discover an unknown number. It is a ritual with steps, and both of you perform the steps, and at the end you arrive where you both expected to arrive, and the point of the whole performance is something other than the price. The point is the relationship. You buy your greens from the same woman most weeks. She knows your face, your basket, and roughly your circumstances. You know that she has a son in the army and that her knees are bad. When you tell her the chicory is tired, she is not insulted because you are supposed to say the chicory is tired. When she tells you that at that price she may as well hand it out at the church door, you are not moved because she is supposed to say that. Then she puts a small handful of something extra on top of what you bought and says nothing about it. And that is the actual transaction. That is her telling you she wants you back next week. There are people who cannot be shortchanged, and people who can. A woman who comes every week and is known cannot be, because the cost to the seller of being caught is a customer for life. A servant sent down from one of the new districts, who does not shop here often, who speaks with an accent from the north, who is spending someone else's money and will not check the weight, can be, and frequently is. A foreigner. Absolutely. There is a whole informal price schedule that exists nowhere on paper and is understood by everyone standing in this square, and your position on it is the accumulated result of years of showing up. You have watched a young wife, newly arrived from a village, be quietly cheated on the weight of beans twice in a month, and you have watched her learn. And now she is not. Nobody taught her in words. She simply started standing differently. The scales themselves are a subject. Some of them are true. Some of them are true in one direction. There is a public weighing office, and there are inspectors, and the inspectors come, and everyone knows the day they come. By the time your basket is heavy, you have been in the square just under an hour. The bells have gone twice. The light has climbed the front of the buildings on the east side and is now standing on the awnings, and the smell of the place has changed. Wet greens giving way to warm fish, which is the signal to go home. You cross the open middle of the square, where the paving is worn to a shine, and you pass the statue. It is not old. It went up 4 years ago, in the summer of 1889, and it is a hooded figure in dark bronze on a high pedestal, hands folded, face down, looking toward the Vatican across the river. the friar Giordano Bruno, burned in this square in 1600, put up here 3 centuries later by the students and the freethinkers and the anti-clerical societies, and paid for by public subscription from all over Europe. The Pope refused to appear in public the day it was unveiled. There was talk, seriously, of him leaving the city altogether. The government let it happen and stood back and said the square belonged to the municipality. The women of this quarter have opinions about it, and the opinions do not divide the way an outsider would guess. Some cross themselves going past. Some do not look at it at all, deliberately, the way you decline to look at a person you are angry with. Some think it is a piece of politics that has nothing to do with them, imposed on a place where they buy vegetables, and resent it on those grounds only. Your neighbor, 2 doors down, who never misses a mass, thinks the statue is ugly, which is her entire position, and which she will defend at length. You walk past it most mornings of your life. Some days it is a man in a hood. Some days it is a public argument in bronze, and the argument is not settled, and both sides are still in the city, and one of them lives across the river behind a wall and refuses to come out. Today it is a place to change hands on the basket, because the handle is cutting into your fingers. You turn out of the square into the shade of the narrow street and start back toward the bridge. The street lets you out onto the embankment, and the noise arrives before the light does. It is a particular noise, and by now you can name its parts without thinking. There is the ring of iron on stone, which is a man dressing a block of travertine to fit a course. There is the slow grinding of a winch, which lifts the block. There is the shouting that goes with the winch, because a stone of that size coming up on a rope is a thing several men have to agree about out loud. Under all of it, there is the sound of carts, always carts, hauling rubble out and hauling cut stone in, their wheels finding every gap between the paving blocks. You shift the basket to the other arm and start along toward the bridge. To your right, where the river ought to be, there is a wall. It is new, or new enough that the stone still has that raw, pale look, and it goes up higher than your head, and then higher still, and along the top of it there is a parapet and a road, and a line of young plane trees planted at even intervals like buttons on a coat. From where you are standing, you cannot see the water at all. You know it is there. You can smell it faintly, that cold mineral smell that the Tiber has in spring. But you cannot see it, and you would have to climb to see it. And there is nowhere on this stretch to climb. 20 years ago, you could have walked down to it from here in about a dozen steps. This is worth slowing down for, because the walls you are walking beside are the largest single thing the new government did to this city, and almost nobody outside Rome has ever heard of them. In the last days of December in 1870, only 2 months after the Italian army came through the wall at Porta Pia and made Rome the capital, the Tiber flooded. It flooded the way it had flooded roughly every generation for 2,000 years. The water came up into the Pantheon and stood there. It came into the ghetto, which lay lowest of all, and into the shops along the Ripetta, and into the ground floors of half the streets on this side of the river as well. People moved upstairs and waited, because that was what you did. Because everyone's grandmother had done it. There were marble plaques on walls all over the city showing where earlier floods had reached, some of them at the height of a tall man's shoulder, and the plaques were treated less as warnings than as local landmarks. You gave directions by them. The new government looked at that flood and drew a different conclusion than the popes had drawn. The popes had generally rebuilt, blessed the water, and set the plaque. The new government decided that the capital city of a modern European nation could not spend one winter in every 15 with its ground floors underwater, and that the river would be made to stop. The plan was to line both banks of the Tiber through the whole city with masonry walls, set them back from each other at a fixed distance, so that the channel between them was wide and straight and deep, and let the flood water rush through instead of spreading out. Great walls is what the Romans called them, and the name stuck, and that is what you are walking beside now. They began in the 1870s, and they were still working at it through the 1880s, and they are still working at it this spring, section by section, upstream and down. The engineering is not the interesting part. What is interesting, and what nobody says in the speeches, is what had to be taken away first. Because a river with houses right down to the water is not a decorative arrangement. It is an economy. It had been one here for a very long time. Start with the mills. There were floating mills on the Tiber, moored in the current, wooden hulls with wheels between them. And the current turned the wheels, and the wheels turned the stones, and the stones ground grain for the city. There had been mills like that in this river since the 6th century, when the Goths cut the aqueducts, and the city had to find another way to grind. Some of the ones broken up in your lifetime were held on rights that had passed down families for generations. A miller's boy learned the river the way a cabinet maker's boy learns grain, where it ran fast, where the mud came up after rain, how to read the color of the water 3 days before a rise, straighten the channel and deepen it and wall it, and the moorings are gone, and the trade is gone, and there is nothing to inherit. Then the boatmen. The Tiber carried goods up from the port at Fiumicino, wine and timber and lime and building sand, and men made their living off loading and unloading and poling and hauling. There were steps down to the water every little way along the old banks, worn hollow in the middle, and landing stages, and small yards where boats were repaired. The Ripetta had a curved double staircase going down to the water that people said was the handsomest thing on the river, and it was demolished for the wall, and there is a photograph of it in a shop window near the Corso that men of a certain age still stop and look at. Then everything that used the water because it was cheap to be next to. Tanners, who need water constantly and are not welcome anywhere else. Dyers. Laundresses working the shallows in summer with the linen spread on the gravel to bleach. Lime burners. Sand diggers, who took river sand out by the cartload and sold it to builders, and who were putting themselves out of work with every load because the sand went into the very walls that were closing the river off. And behind all of them, the housing. Narrow, tall buildings on lanes that ran down to the landings, 300 and 400 years old, some of them older underneath, with workshops on the ground floor and families above. On this side of the river, a whole strip of the quarter came down. Across the water, the ghetto came down almost entirely, its low, crowded blocks cleared in stages through the 1880s, and the people who had lived there packed into whatever they could find while the new streets went up. Here is the part that is easy to get wrong when it is told as a story about progress. The old riverside was, by any measure, a doctor of the period would have used. Unhealthy, damp that never left the walls, sanitation running straight into the water people also worked in. Fever every summer. The men who ordered the walls were not lying about that, and some of them believed it sincerely. The clearance genuinely ended a kind of dampness that shortened lives. It is simply that ending it was not the only thing that happened, and the people it happened to were not asked. Because when a strip of old housing comes down, the families in it need somewhere to go, and what they are offered is not next door. The new quarters were going up outside the old walls, out past the Porter Pier, along the new avenues, over on the Esquiline, where the rows of tall apartment blocks stand with their shutters closed, out toward the Prati on the flat ground opposite the Vatican, which speculators bought as farmland and laid out in a grid while the paint was still wet on the plans. Those buildings are 5 and 6 floors, and they are decent enough, and they are also further from every place a poor family works than the place they came from was, and they cost more. That is the arithmetic that decided things. A displaced tanner's family being asked to pay a Prati rent on a river worker's income makes the choice for them, and the choice is to go further out still, or to double up with relations, or to squeeze into a room in a quarter like this one, which is how a building meant for 6 families comes to be holding 9. You know the shape of it, because you have watched it happen to people you know by sight. A family disappears from a lane. Somebody says they have gone out to San Lorenzo, or out past the walls, or in with a sister at Testaccio. 6 months later, a man from that family turns up in the market on a Saturday, because the market here is still cheaper, and he has walked in, and he will walk back. Nobody calls this displacement. They say the house came down, and they went out to where it is cheaper. That is the whole account, and it is accurate. There is a rumor about every stretch of wall before it is built. There is always a man who has heard which lane goes next, and he is usually wrong. And being wrong does not stop him being listened to, because the alternative is not knowing. When the wall came through nearest here, there were 4 separate versions of how far back the demolition would reach, and people made decisions on them. Whether to take a longer lease, whether to spend on a new stove, whether to let a daughter accept a man who lived on the wrong side of the line. You cannot plan against a rumor. You can only bet on one. You reach the bridge and start across, and here, for the length of the crossing, you can see the river properly. It runs greenish and fast and low between its 2 pale walls, and it is straight, and it is empty. No mills, no moored boats to speak of, no steps, no landings, nobody down at the edge doing anything at all, because there is no edge to be at. The water goes past the city the way a train goes past a field. An old woman who sells thread near the bridgehead told you once that when she was young, the river had noise on it. She meant men shouting between boats, and the mill wheels, and a particular kind of singing that went with hauling, and dogs. Now the noise is all up here on the parapet, and it is wheels and hooves and the building sites. And it belongs to the road, and not the water. You stop for a moment at the middle of the span and set the basket on the stone while you change hands again. Below you, the current pushes past a pier and folds white. The city is safe from it now, or safer. The ground floors will stay dry. That is worth something, and you would not give it back. It is only that the river used to be a place, and now it is a thing the city has its back to, and both of those are true at once, and nobody thought to write down the second one. You pick up the basket and walk on toward your own side. The courtyard is already occupied when you come through the archway with the basket on your hip. 2 women have the basin, and a third is waiting with a bundle at her feet, and the light coming down the well of the building has that thin quality it keeps until the sun clears the roof line, which will not happen for another hour on this side. You set your things down and take your place in the order, which nobody states aloud and nobody disputes. The order is known. It follows roughly who has the most children, adjusted for who has a husband on early shift and needs a shirt dry by tomorrow, adjusted again for anyone who has recently done someone a favor. You are third today. Third is fine. Third means the water in the basin will still be warm enough to bear when your turn comes, and cloudy enough that you will be washing in what has already washed somebody else's linen, which is normal and which nobody remarks on. There is one tap in this courtyard. It sits above a stone basin, worn into a shallow curve by hands and knuckles, and the corners of wet sheets, and the curve is deeper at the left end because most people are right-handed and lean their weight that way. That worn place is older than anyone standing around it. While you wait, you sort. This is not an idle motion. You are separating what will be washed properly from what will only be rinsed. And within the first pile, you are separating what can take a hard scrubbing from what cannot survive another one. Your husband's working shirts go in the hard pile. The children's things go in the hard pile, all of them, because children's clothes live a violent life. The good tablecloth that comes out 4 or 5 times a year goes in the soft pile and will be handled the way you would handle a sleeping infant. The ash comes out of a tin you keep by the hearth. You have been putting wood ash in it all week, sieved through a cloth to take out the grit, and you tip a quantity of it into a pot of hot water and let it stand and go slippery. This is lye, though nobody calls it that here. It is simply the ash water, and it is what actually gets grease out of cloth, and it costs you nothing except the trouble of saving it. The soap is a separate matter. Hard soap comes in a bar from the shop. Olive oil soap, greenish and heavy. And it is the single most expensive thing in this entire operation. So you use it on collars and cuffs, and wherever a thing will actually be seen, and you let the ash water do the rest. There is an economy in that division which is worth naming. You are spending money where the cloth will be looked at, and spending your own labor where it will not. Your turn arrives. You kneel, or half kneel, with one knee on a folded sack, because the stone is cold and wet and unforgiving, and you put your hands into the water. Nobody who has not done this understands the arms. It is not the scrubbing, which is quick and violent and over in a moment for each piece. It is the wringing. A wet sheet holds an astonishing amount of water, and getting that water out means twisting the cloth against itself with your whole upper body, while your fingers keep hold of something slick and heavy, and trying to escape. A wet double sheet weighs something on the order of 15 or 20 pounds before you have wrung it. You do this many times in a morning. Your forearms will ache tonight in a specific band below the elbow, and you know the exact place, because you have known it since you were 9 years old. 2 women can wring a sheet in half the time and less than half the effort by taking an end each and turning in opposite directions. This is why wash day is social. It is not chiefly companionship, though it is that too. It is that certain items require 4 hands, and the 4 hands must belong to 2 people who have agreed, without ever putting it in words, to be available to each other on a recurring basis for the rest of their lives. So you and the woman from the 2nd floor take the sheet between you and turn, leaning back, feeling the cloth go rigid and then thin, and the water runs out of it in a rope and hits the stone. Now, let the scene stand still for a moment, because the cloth itself deserves an accounting. Consider what a household like yours actually owns in the way of textiles. Not what a shop window in the Corso holds. What is actually in your 2 rooms? You have 2 sheets per bed, and there are 2 beds, so 4 sheets, and one of the 4 is patched down its middle seam where it wore through first, as they always do, and was cut lengthwise and sewn back together with the worn edges, now at the outsides. That operation is called turning a sheet, and it buys you perhaps 3 more years. Your mother did it to this same sheet before you. Your husband has 3 shirts. One is for work, one is better, one is the one he is wearing. He has 2 pairs of trousers and 1 jacket, and the jacket is 9 years old and has been relined once. He has 1 hat, which he takes off in church, and to certain men in the street and to nobody else. You have 2 everyday skirts. Dark, because dark cloth conceals what light cloth confesses. You have a good skirt and a good bodice that are kept in a chest and worn to weddings, funerals, Easter, and the day a child makes a first communion. You have 3 blouses, of which one is genuinely presentable. You have a shawl. The shawl matters more than any other single object you own, because it is the thing that makes an outfit finished when you step into the street, and it covers what is beneath it. And a woman with a decent shawl is a woman whose circumstances cannot be immediately read. The children have between 2 and 4 changes each, depending on age, and how recently something has come down from an older one. That is the whole of it. Perhaps 40 pieces of cloth for 5 people, and every single piece has a known history, a projected future, and a place in a sequence. Nothing is thrown away. When a shirt is finished as a shirt, it becomes patches for other shirts. When it is finished as patches, it becomes a cleaning cloth. When it is finished as a cleaning cloth, it goes into the rag basket, and the rag man comes down the lane with a handcart, perhaps once a month, and gives you a few coins or a needle or a paper of pins for a bundle of them. And those rags go off to be pulped or reworked into cheap cloth somewhere else, and possibly come back to you years later as something you buy. Cloth in this city does not end. It only circulates and thins. The arithmetic of keeping it going is worth stating plainly, because it is the part that vanishes from every account of the period. Wash day takes you the better part of 2 days a week, counted honestly, from carrying and heating water through, washing, wringing, hanging, taking in, and pressing. Mending is another evening or 2, done by lamp, or by window light, making a garment from cloth, which you do when the price of the cloth plus your hours beats the price of a finished thing, which is nearly always, is a matter of many evenings for a single item. Set it all together, and you are spending somewhere between 15 and 25 hours in an ordinary week on textiles alone. No machine assists you at any point. There is no wringer, no washing machine, no hot tap. The iron is heated on charcoal. The needle is a needle. 20 hours a week is half a working man's week. It produces no wage, appears in no survey of employment, and would be described by anyone asked as simply what a wife does. You could not have explained it in those terms, and would probably have been irritated by anyone who tried. But you know the size of it in your arms. The good iron belongs to the woman on the ground floor. Her husband works at a foundry and brought it home years ago, and it is heavier and flatter and holds heat better than anything else in the building. And she lends it out with a strictness that everyone accepts as fair. You may have it Tuesday afternoons. In exchange, and this exchange has never once been mentioned by either of you, her two youngest come up your stairs on the mornings she takes work across the river, and you feed them whatever the pot has and send them down again at noon. That is the arrangement, and there are perhaps 8 or 9 like it running through this one building. The widow at the top does everyone's buttonholes, because her eyes are still good and her hands are quick, and nobody asks her for rent money help she cannot give. The woman with the sewing machine, and there is exactly one in the building, takes long seams for you at a rate that is not quite a favor and not quite a price. When somebody is ill, the pot on somebody else's fire quietly gets larger. None of this is charity, and all of it is insurance. Nobody here has savings that would survive 6 weeks of no work. What they have instead is a network of small, unrepaid obligations, spread thin enough that no single failure brings it down, and it functions most of the time better than anything the city has yet thought to build. The line goes up from your window across the well to the bracket on the wall opposite, and you send the wet things out along it with a pulley that squeaks, and that you have oiled twice, and that has never once stopped squeaking. Below, someone shouts up to mind the drip. You call down that you are minding it. You are not, entirely. By late morning, the courtyard is roofed over with wet cloth, sheets and shirts, and small dresses hanging in rows at 4 different levels, and the light coming down through them arrives at the stones already softened and moving. Your hands are raw across the knuckles and at the base of each finger, and when you step back inside and the air hits them, they sting, then burn, then settle to an ache you will stop noticing in 20 minutes. The room smells of wet wool and ash, and the particular sourness of steam that has nowhere to go. You open the window wider. Outside, the sheets lift once together in a movement of air off the river, all of them at the same moment, and then hang still again. The good chair goes to the window. It is the only chair in the 2 rooms with a whole seat, rush-woven and replaced twice, and it lives most of the day against the wall, where nobody can wear it out. In the early afternoon, you drag it across the tiles to the one window that faces the courtyard. Angle it so that the light falls over your left shoulder, and sit down with the basket in your lap. Inside the basket, under a folded cloth, are 41 shirt collars, cut and waiting, a paper of needles, a wooden bobbin of white thread, and a strip of card on which a workshop clerk has written a number in pencil. The number is how many you took. When you bring them back, it will be checked against how many you return, and against how many of those pass. This is the second trade. Your husband has a trade with a name, and a bench, and a smell of glue and shavings, and people in the quarter know what he is. You have this. It has no name that anybody uses. If a census taker came up the 4 flights and asked what you did, the answer that would go into the column is nothing, or the wife of a cabinet maker, and both of those would be written down without anybody feeling that a lie had been told. Consider what that column leaves out. In Rome, in the 1890s, women worked constantly and were counted almost never. They took in washing, which meant carrying other people's linen up and downstairs, and standing over cold water for hours, and returning it pressed. They sewed. They strung beads and glass for the trade that sold rosaries and souvenirs to pilgrims, and to the growing traffic of foreigners who came to see the ruins. They sold at market stalls, or beside them, or from a basket set on the ground, where a stall would have cost money. They went out as servants, which was the largest single occupation for women in the city, and the only one that reliably appeared in the official figures, because a servant lived at an address that was not her own, and so had to be written down somewhere. Everything else dissolved. A woman doing piecework in her own room was, to the arithmetic of the state, not employed. She had no workplace. She had no employer in any sense the law recognized, because the workshop that gave out the collars would say, if pressed, that it had simply sold her the materials and agreed to buy back the finished article. She had no hours, because nobody set them. She had no wage, because she was paid by the piece. And so the numbers that survive from the period, the ones printed in tables and argued over by economists then and since, describe a city in which a great deal of the labor is simply not there. You can correct for it a little by looking sideways at other records, at the volume of finished goods leaving the workshops compared to the number of hands inside them, at the complaints of male trade societies about work being sent out to be done cheaper elsewhere, at the household budgets collected here and there by reformers, in which the income column has an entry that the family calls sewing, and that accounts for perhaps 1/5 of everything coming in, 1/5 of everything, from a person the tables record as idle. The first collar takes you 11 minutes. You do not know that it takes 11 minutes, because there is no clock in the room, but you know it in the older way, by how far the light has moved on the wall. The stitch is a running back stitch along the fold, small and even, and the smallness matters more than the speed. The workshop that takes these back has a man whose entire job is to hold a finished collar up to the window and look along the seam. If the stitches wander, if they are visibly larger at the end of a run than at the start, if the thread has been pulled hard enough to pucker the linen, the piece comes back to you, and you unpick it and do it again, and you are not paid twice for the same collar. Here is the part of this that is worth slowing down for, because it explains more about the century than almost anything else in the room. You are paid by the piece. The rate is set by the workshop, and it is set low, and the workshop knows exactly what it is doing when it sets it. because the whole arrangement runs on a piece of arithmetic that works against you the harder you work. Say the rate is 4 centesimi a collar. That is a plausible figure for plain work of this kind in Rome in these years, and it sounds like almost nothing, and it is almost nothing. At 11 minutes, a collar you would earn something in the region of 20 centesimi an hour, and if you could sew for 10 unbroken hours, which you cannot, you would have 2 lire at the end of it. Your husband, a skilled man at a bench, earns perhaps 3 lire and a half for a full day, when there is a full day to be had. Now suppose you get faster. You have done this work for 9 years, and you are faster. You can do a collar in 7 minutes, sometimes 6, and your seams pass the man at the window nearly every time. Your hourly earnings rise, and for 1 season, perhaps 2, you are doing well. And then the rate falls. It falls to 3 centesimi and a half, and then to 3. And when you ask, the clerk says, without unkindness, that they have plenty of women who will take it at 3. And this is true. He is not lying to you. There are always more hands than collars. This is the mechanism. In a trade paid by the hour, skill raises the wage, because the employer must keep the skilled worker or lose her. In a trade paid by the piece, with a queue of replacements at the door, skill lowers the rate, because the fastest worker sets the standard against which the price is judged. Every improvement you make is eventually taken from you and converted into a cheaper collar. Your speed is real. Your income barely moves. The only thing that has changed across 9 years is how many collars the city gets for the same money. Understand it, and you will find it everywhere in this century. It is the reason the workshops send the work out at all, rather than putting benches in a room and hiring women to sit at them. Work sent out has no rent, no lighting, no heat, no supervision, no responsibility for the worker when the order's thin in August. The overheads are transferred to your room, your window, your oil, your chair, your eyes. You are paying for the factory. It is simply that the factory is 4 flights up and belongs to your landlord. The 8th collar is finished. You lay it on the pile squarely, corners aligned, because a tidy bundle is looked at more kindly than a loose one, and you learned that early. There is a second thing governing all of this, and it has nothing to do with money. The rule in the quarter, unspoken and absolute, is that there is respectable work, and there is other work, and the line between them is not the task, and not the pay. It is the doorway. Work done inside your own rooms is respectable. Work done in the street is a different matter. A woman who sews collars at her window for 3 centesimi apiece is a good wife helping her family. A woman who sells vegetables from a basket on the pavement for rather more than that is spoken of with a small hesitation before the sentence goes on. A woman who goes out as a servant is respectable because she has entered another household and is inside somebody's doorway, even if it is not her own. A woman who works the laundry troughs at the river in the open, in front of everyone, is respectable in her own street, and less so 3 streets over, where they do not know her mother. None of this maps onto how hard the work is, or how much it earns. It maps onto visibility. The women in your building understand the rule perfectly, and none of them could tell you where it came from, and it costs them a great deal. It is the reason the trades that can be done behind a shutter are the ones flooded with hands, and the reason the rates in those trades are the lowest in the city. Respectability is priced in. You are paying for it in centesimi every time the man at the window holds your seam up to the light. You know women who have decided the price is too high. There is one on the floor below who sells at the market and does not care what is said, and she eats better than you do, and her daughters have shoes in both seasons. You have thought about it. You have not done it. That is a choice, and it is a real one, and you make it again roughly once a month without ever saying so aloud. Around 4, the quality of the light changes. It does not dim so much as go flat. The courtyard well takes the sun for a few hours in the middle of the day, and then loses it entirely, and after that the light in the room is even and grey, and gives you nothing, and the white thread on white linen stops separating for your eye. You could light the lamp. Oil costs money, and the collars pay 3 centesimi, and there is a calculation in that which comes out badly, and you have done it enough times to know the answer without doing it again. So you stop. You count what you have finished, 23 collars, and you check them once more with the light held up over your shoulder from the window, and you find one where the thread has pulled, and you unpick 4 inches of it and redo it while you can still see. Then you fold the cloth over the basket and put the basket on the shelf, and you carry the good chair back to its place against the wall, where nobody will sit on it. Go back a few hours. The afternoon at the window has a seam in it, and the seam is the middle of the day, and it is the only part of the day when the 2 rooms hold everyone who lives in them at once. The workshop where your husband works closes at noon and does not open again until 2:30. And this is not generosity. It is simply how the city works, and has worked for as long as anyone can name, and it will not change for another 2 generations. Shops close, offices close. The ministries across the river empty out into the streets, and the clerks go home or go to a table somewhere, and for 2.5 hours the whole apparatus of the capital stops moving and eats. You hear him on the stairs before you see him. 4 flights makes a particular rhythm in a man who has climbed it twice a day for 11 years, and you know it from the boots of every other man in the building. The children come up separately and louder. The middle one has been at school since 8 and is hungry in the way that has no manners in it. The youngest has been in the courtyard and on the lane, and possibly as far as the church steps, and has a torn place at the knee that you register and file away, and do not mention, because mentioning it now would cost you the meal. The eldest comes last, because the eldest is 9, and has begun to arrive places deliberately. The pot has been on the charcoal since 10. This is the whole architecture of your cooking, and it is worth slowing down for, because the kitchen you are imagining probably does not exist in this room. There is no oven. There is no stove of the kind that a comfortable household in London or Berlin might already have, cast iron and enameled, with a firebox and rings and a warming drawer. What you have is a raised masonry shelf against the wall with 2 hollows in it, and in each hollow you build a small fire of charcoal, and over each hollow sits a grate, and on the grate sits a pot. 2 hollows, 2 pots. That is the entire capacity of your kitchen, and everything you have ever cooked in your married life has been shaped by that number. It means you do not roast. Roasting needs an oven, and an oven needs a fire far larger than 2 hollows of charcoal, and the fuel to run one would cost more in a week than you spend on meat in a month. If something is to be baked in this quarter, it goes to the baker, who has the oven, and who will bake your dish in the falling heat after the morning's bread for a few centesimi, and who is used to a procession of women arriving at 11 with covered trays. You do this perhaps twice a month. On a feast day, you do it certainly. It's not the everyday. The everyday is one pot, and long time, and cheap cuts, and whatever is in season broken down into it. Charcoal burns steady and low and does not roar, and a Roman kitchen fire is not a blaze you feed, but a bed of heat you manage, moved around with a pair of tongs and coaxed toward one side of the grate or the other. It is very good at simmering something for 4 hours. It is very bad at anything sudden. So the cooking of this city divides cleanly. There are dishes that take a great deal of time and no attention, and there are dishes that take almost no time at all, and there is very little in between. On one side, beans with a bone in them, cooked until the beans give up. Tripe with tomato, which needs hours and forgives everything. Oxtail, which is the least fashionable thing in the market, and the best thing that comes out of it, cooked from morning until evening with celery, until the meat comes off the bone with a wooden spoon. On the other side, bread and oil, chicory boiled and dressed, an egg when there are eggs, cheese grated over pasta with pepper, and a little of the water it was boiled in, which takes 4 minutes, and is one of the finest things anyone in this city eats, and which exists in exactly this form, because it can be made by a person with 1 pot, no oven, and no money. Today it is the beans. There is a piece of pork skin in them, bought for almost nothing at the market, and treated with more respect than its price suggests. And there is a bay leaf from the plant the woman on the 2nd floor keeps in a tin on her sill, and there is bread that is now a day and a half old, and is better for it, because you tear it into the bowl, and the beans soften it. You serve into 4 bowls and a 5th. You take the smallest portion, and you do this without thinking about it, and without announcing it. And this is so ordinary in households like yours, across the whole peninsula, that it does not register as sacrifice to anyone at the table, including you. The wine comes out of a flask that holds 2 liters, and the flask is not yours. It belongs to the cellar shop on the corner, and you carry it down empty and bring it back full, and you pay by the liter, and the flask goes back and forth for years. The wine comes from the hills southeast of the city, the Castelli, in carts that come down the old road at night, and it is white and cheap and not very strong, and it costs less than the same volume of anything else that has calories in it. That last point is the point. This is not an indulgence, and nobody at this table treats it as one. It is food. It is calories that keep at room temperature in a city with no ice, in a room with no cold place, and it is drunk with the meal, because that is when calories are eaten. The children drink it cut with water. The eldest gets it cut about half. The youngest gets a colored spoonful in a glass of water, more for inclusion than for anything else. Nobody at this table has ever thought about this arrangement for as long as a full second. The talk begins after the first few mouthfuls, which is the rule everywhere. Your husband has news, and the news is a shape you have learned to read before he finishes it. There was a man at the workshop this morning asking about the tables. Not buying, asking. Asking is what happens for 6 weeks before an order arrives, or asking is what happens instead of an order arriving, and there is no way to tell which from the inside. The building work in the new quarters has slowed. He says this the way people say things they have said before. 2 years ago, there were men on scaffolds on every street beyond the walls, and every one of those buildings needed doors and shutters and stairs and cupboards, and the workshops could not keep pace, and a cabinet maker could name his weeks. Now, half of those buildings stand up finished and empty, with the windows blank, and the men who owned them are in the hands of banks, and the banks are in trouble of their own that gets into the newspapers in words nobody at this table entirely follows. He follows some of it. There is a paper that goes around the workshop, 1 copy for 11 men, read aloud in pieces at the midday break by whoever reads best, and it comes home in his head rather than his pocket. This is how most of the news in this building arrives. 2 men in the whole quarter buy a paper daily. Everyone else hears it second-hand at a table like this one, worn smooth by 3 retellings, with the numbers slightly wrong and the outrage slightly larger. You listen and you sort it. You are doing arithmetic while he talks, which is a thing you do at every meal and have never mentioned. If the workshop goes short in the summer, the piecework has to carry more, and the piecework pays what it pays, and there is the flour to think about, and there is the rent, which does not care about any of this. You do not say this at the table. You say something about the man who was asking, whether he had the look of a real buyer, what he was wearing. Your husband considers it seriously, because you have been right about this before, more than once, in a way neither of you has ever quite acknowledged out loud. The eldest wants to know what America is like. A cousin's name came up somewhere in the talk, and the child caught it. Your husband says he does not know, which is true, and then he describes it anyway for about a minute, which is also what everyone does. The middle child says nothing at all and eats a great deal. The youngest wants more bread and is given some. Then the meal is over, and the second architecture of the day takes hold. You push the shutters to, not closed, but angled, so the room fills with a striped brown light, and the air stays moving, and the worst of the sun stays outside on the stone. The lane below goes quiet by degrees. The seller who has been shouting since 7 stops shouting. A dog somewhere gives up. 2 floors down, someone drags a chair. Your husband sits back with the last of his glass and does not talk anymore. He has perhaps 40 minutes before the walk back, and he will spend most of them motionless with his eyes half shut. And this is not laziness. It is the correct use of a body that will be standing at a bench until 7. The youngest is asleep across the end of the bed within 4 minutes, still holding a piece of bread. The middle one goes back down to the courtyard, because nothing has ever tired that child. The eldest lingers near the window, wanting something, unsure what. And you clear. You always clear. You take the bowls down to the courtyard tap and rinse them, and you scrape the bean pot and set it to soak, and you bank the charcoal down carefully to almost nothing, because charcoal costs money, and a fire, kept alive at a whisper, is cheaper than a fire lit twice. When you come back up, the room has gone very still, and the light through the slats is lying in bars across the floorboards and across the foot of the bed. And there is no sound in it but breathing, and somewhere out over the roofs a single bell striking one, for nobody in particular. By 2 o'clock the bars of light have crawled off the bed and onto the wall, and the eldest has to be woken, which is its own small negotiation, and then walked. The school is 9 minutes away if you walk it at a child's pace, and 6 if you walk it at yours. It sits in 2 rooms on the ground floor of a building that used to be something else, and nobody can quite agree on what. The windows are high and narrow. The floor is brick. In winter, there is a stove that the teacher feeds herself out of a coal allowance that runs out in February. And in spring, like now, the door stands open to the lane, and the lessons compete with the street, and generally lose. You walk your eldest to the corner, and no further, because at 9 years old, being delivered to the door is a humiliation that would follow her for a month. You watch her go the last 30 steps. She does not look back. This is correct, and you would think less of her if she did. Here is something worth slowing down for, because the choice that sits behind that 9-minute walk is not a small one. And in Rome, in the 1890s, it was one of the sharpest choices a family in your position could be asked to make. There were 2 kinds of school your daughter could have gone to. There was the parish school, run by the church, taught in many cases by nuns, older than the Italian state by centuries, and quite certain of itself. And there was the communal school, funded and inspected by the municipality, part of a national system that the new Italy had been trying to build since unification, with an energy that far outran its budget. The law said your daughter had to have some schooling. The Casati law of 1859, extended across the peninsula, as the peninsula was assembled, required the first 2 years of elementary instruction, and a later reform pushed at 3. But the law required it of the communes, and the communes were poor, and enforcement was a matter of local will and local money. And in much of Italy, the requirement functioned as an aspiration written down in a book in an office somewhere. Rome, being the capital, being watched, being the shop window of the new nation, did rather better than the national average. That is a low bar, and Rome cleared it and was pleased with itself for clearing it. So the question in your household was never whether the child went. It was which door she walked through. And that question was not really about arithmetic or handwriting. It was about which Rome you were signing your family into, because there were 2 of them, and they were not being polite about it. 23 years earlier, in September of 1870, Italian troops had put artillery to the wall near the Porta Pia and come into the city, and the Pope's temporal power over Rome had ended in an afternoon. The Pope of your childhood, Pius IX, had refused every arrangement offered to him afterward, declined the guarantees, declined the money, and withdrawn into the Vatican palaces, declaring himself a prisoner there. He never came out. Neither did his successor, Leo XIII, who is Pope now in this spring, and who is a subtler and more political man, but who has not moved an inch on this particular point. The popes will not leave the Vatican, will not recognize the kingdom, will not attend, will not acknowledge. Catholics have been instructed not to vote in national elections. the phrase used is ne eletti, ne elettori, neither elected nor electors. So the government sits in palaces on one side of the river, and the papacy sits behind its own walls on the other, and neither speaks to the other. And between them, going about the business of a Tuesday, is you. And it reaches the kitchen table. That is the part that gets lost when this is told as a story about two great powers glaring at one another. It came all the way down. It reached which holidays you kept. The state had its calendar now. The 20th of September, the anniversary of the breach at the Porta Pia, celebrated with flags and speeches and a day off for government offices, and observed by the parish clergy as a day of mourning. The feast of the Statuto in June, honoring the Constitution, with troops in the streets, the King's birthday, and laid over that, unmoved, the older calendar, the patron saints, the parish feast, the days that emptied the workshops, because everybody's grandmother said they emptied the workshops. Your husband's shop keeps the saints. The clerk, 2 floors below, keeps the state days, because his ministry closes, and he is paid regardless. The two of you pass on the stairs on mornings when one of you is working and the other is not, and there is a small politeness in how neither of you mentions it. It reached which newspaper came into the room. There were papers that spoke for the government, and papers that spoke for the church, and papers that mostly printed crime stories and the price of wheat, and were therefore the most widely read of all. Your husband brings home, when he brings home anything, whatever a man at the bench has finished with, so the politics of your household are second-hand in the literal sense, 4 days old and folded to fit a pocket. It reached the processions, whether you stood on the pavement with a candle when the parish carried its saint through the lanes, or whether you stayed at the window, or whether you were in the street watching the bersaglieri go past at a run with their plumes streaming, or all three in the same month without feeling any contradiction whatsoever. And this is the thing that the histories, written by people who cared enormously about the quarrel, tend to get wrong about people like you. Most Romans did not choose. Not publicly. Not once and for all. They lived in both cities at the same time, and moved between them all day long, the way you move between 2 rooms. The strategy was silence, and it was practiced with real skill. You did not announce yourself. You did not tell the priest what your husband said about the tax on flour. And you did not tell the man from the ministry what the priest said about the tax on anything. You greeted the parish priest in the lane with genuine warmth, because he had baptized all 3 of your children, and had once, in a bad winter, arranged for a sack of flour to arrive without anybody having to be asked for it. And you also, without any sense of betrayal, took the government's free school when it was offered, because it was free, and it was near, and the teacher was good. That was the arrangement in most households on your staircase. Church for the sacraments, and the calendar, and the emergencies. State for the school, and the paperwork, and the pension, if you were ever lucky enough to be near a pension. Nobody wrote this down as a philosophy. It simply worked, and things that work do not need to be defended. Which brings us back to what your daughter is being taught in those 2 brick-floored rooms. Reading, writing, arithmetic to a level the teacher describes as sufficient. A great deal of copying, because paper is expensive, and the way you get value out of a sheet is to fill both sides of it with the same letter until the hand learns it without the mind's help. And, threaded through everything, a quiet and constant lesson in being Italian, which is a thing her grandparents were not and had never expected to be. This is worth naming plainly. In 1861, when the kingdom was declared, something like 3/4 of the people inside it could not read. By the 1890s, that has improved, and improved unevenly, better in the north, worse the further south you go, better in cities, worse in the country. Rome sits somewhere in the middle and flatters itself upward. And the improvement is sharper for boys than for girls. Because when a family has to decide whose schooling can be sacrificed for whose labor, the decision is not usually made in the daughter's favor. You can sign your name. You learned it from a nun with a slate and a great deal of patience. And you can read a printed page slowly if the words are ordinary, and nobody is watching you do it. Your mother could not do either. Your daughter, in 3 years, will read faster than you do, and will one day read a letter aloud to you. And you will listen and be proud, and feel, underneath the pride, something that has no name and is not quite loss. The other thing they are teaching her, and this is deliberate, is language. She is being taught to speak and write a standardized Italian that almost nobody in the lane actually uses. At home, in the courtyard, at the fountain, in the market, the language is Romanesco, dropped consonants, its own vocabulary, its own jokes, its own poetry, and 100 years of it written down by poets who knew exactly what they were doing. That is the language your husband swears in, and your children play in, and you count money in. School is a place where you speak differently. Every child on the staircase understands this by the age of 6, and none of them could explain it. Some of them will grow up bilingual in it, and use it like a tool, one language for the office and one for the family. Some will lose the second one and be embarrassed by parents who did not. That is a slow argument that will run through Italian households for the next 80 years, and it starts in rooms exactly like the one your daughter is sitting in right now, copying a letter. You turn back up the lane. The priest is coming the other way, unhurried, hands behind his back, and he stops and asks after your husband's hand, the one he cut in February, which you had forgotten anyone else knew about, and asks after the youngest, and remarks that the eldest has grown, which is the thing all adults say to all children's mothers everywhere and always. You say something appropriate. He goes on, and in your pocket, folded small against your hip the whole time, is the notice from the commune about the tax on the rooms, printed on cheap paper with a stamp in the corner, and a date by which something must be paid, issued by a government the man you have just been speaking to does not officially believe exists. You carry both of them up 4 flights without thinking about it once. By the time you reach the top of the stairs, the light in the single window has gone the color of weak tea, and that color is a signal, and you respond to it before you have consciously registered it. You put the basket down. You cross to the window. You pull the shutters in. It is not yet dark. The sky above the roofline still holds most of an hour of usable light, and on almost any evening in February or November, you would leave the shutters wide and take that hour gratefully, because light is expensive and daylight is free. But it is spring, and the evenings have turned warm. And warm evenings in this city carry an old instruction that everyone in the quarter obeys without discussion. Close up at dusk. Stay closed until the sun is properly up. Across the courtyard, you can hear the same thing happening in other rooms. The flat clap of wood against stone, one after another, not coordinated and not quite random either, the way birds leave a wire. The woman on the second floor, who has a child of about 4 with a cough that has been going a fortnight, has had her shutters closed since the middle of the afternoon and will not open them tonight at all. Here is what you and everyone around you believe, and here is what is beginning very quietly and quite far away from Trastevere to replace it. Rome sits in the middle of a wide, low, wet plain, the Campagna, that famous ring of green and broken aqueducts that every foreign painter has come to sketch for the last 3 centuries, is beautiful in oil paint and difficult to live in. It has standing water in the low places. It has marsh at the coast, and for as long as anyone has kept records of any kind, going back into antiquity, it has had fever, a fever that comes in summer and autumn, that returns on a schedule, that arrives with chills and leaves, and arrives again 3 days later, and that has emptied villages and stopped armies, and shaped where in this landscape a person could sensibly build a house. The explanation everybody has grown up with is in the name itself. Bad air. The air of the low ground. The air that rises off wet earth after a hot day. The air that hangs in the streets nearest the river once the sun has gone. Breathe enough of it, and you take the fever. That is the theory, and it is old, and it is wrong, and it has nonetheless kept a great many people healthy for a great many centuries, because the practical rules it produces are almost exactly correct. Do not sleep at ground level in the low quarters. Do not be out in the open at dusk in the summer. Close the house at nightfall. Sleep high if you can afford to. Burn something aromatic in the room. Keep away from standing water. Every one of those instructions happens to reduce the number of times a mosquito bites you. And the mosquito is the actual answer. And in the 1890s, the actual answer is arriving. Italian researchers are working on it directly. The parasite in the blood has been identified. Within a very few years, the mosquito's role will be demonstrated well enough to argue about in public. And within a decade, the state will be handing out quinine through post offices and tobacco shops as a matter of national policy. And the map of this country will change because of it. None of that has reached your window. What has reached your window is the shutter, and the netting, and the small clay dish on the sill. The netting is a length of cheap gauze bought 2 summers ago, mended at one corner with thread that does not match. It hangs over the bed the children share, tucked under the mattress edge on 3 sides, and it is the single most fussed-over object in the room between May and October. A tear in it gets repaired the same day. When the youngest was small enough to pull at it, you tied the bottom corners to the bed frame. You would replace it before you replaced almost anything else you own. In the dish, a coil of something that smokes, dried leaves, a pinch of resin, sometimes a few sprigs of a plant that a woman 2 doors down grows in a pot on her landing and sells for almost nothing, whose smell is sharp and lemony and gets into the wool of your clothes and stays there until the wash. Between the smoke and the charcoal from the cooking and the oil lamp, the room by the end of a summer evening has a smell you have stopped being able to detect, and that your husband's mother, who lives in the country, comments on every single time she visits. You light it now. It takes twice. The smoke goes up in a thin line and then flattens against the ceiling and spreads. This is where you live, and the geography of it matters more than almost anything else about your household economy. Trastevere is low. The river is close. The lanes are narrow, and the ground floors are damp, and the courtyards do not drain quickly. Every quarter in this city has a reputation for healthiness or the opposite, and those reputations are old, and they are priced into the rent as precisely as any other feature, which is exactly what the men selling the new apartments understand. If you walk to a newsstand and look at the advertisements for the buildings going up beyond the old walls, in the streets that were fields 10 years ago, you will find the word for healthy or wholesome doing an enormous amount of work. Elevated position, open to the air, above the level of the fever, full sun. Every one of those phrases is a promise about not taking sick in August, and every one of them is attached to a rent that a cabinet maker cannot pay. That is the arrangement, and it is worth saying plainly. Health, in this city, in this decade, is a thing you buy with elevation. The higher the ground, the higher the rent, the healthier the reputation. The hills have always been where the money lived, going back 2,000 years, and the reason is not fashion. The clerks moving into those new streets with their government salaries and their piped water are buying, among other things, a summer in which their children are less likely to be ill, and they are correct to buy it, and it is not available at your price. What is available at your price is discipline. The shutter closed early, the netting mended, the water in the courtyard never left standing in an open vessel, which you enforce with an authority that surprises visitors. A bucket left uncovered overnight will be emptied by you personally, and its owner will hear about it, and you cannot explain why beyond that it is not done, and you happen to be right for reasons nobody in the courtyard could yet articulate. There are also the drains, which are the other half of the story, and the half that is actually being fixed. For most of the century, this city's sewers were the ancient ones, patched, with the great vaulted drain that runs down to the river, still doing work that Romans of the Republic assigned to it. In your lifetime, the new administration has been laying proper collectors along the embankments, connecting the new quarters, digging up streets, and leaving them dug up for months. It is loud, it is filthy while it is happening. It has taken money the city did not have, and it is one of the very few things about the rebuilding that almost everyone agrees was necessary. Trastevere gets it late. Trastevere gets most things late. You have heard from a woman whose brother works for the contractors that your lane is on a list, and you have heard that for 3 years. So the low quarters keep their reputation, and the reputation keeps the rent affordable. And the affordable rent is why you are here. And being here is why the netting matters. The whole chain runs in a circle and closes on itself. And there is not, at your income, a place to break it. The child downstairs with the fortnight cough is not the fever. The cough is a cough, and the mother knows it, and she has kept the shutters closed anyway, because when a child is unwell, you take away every reason for anything else to go wrong. You have done the same. Everyone has done the same. It is not superstition exactly, and it is not medicine exactly, and it has no name. It is simply the accumulated practice of a very old city about how to get its people through the warm months, passed down by women to women in courtyards, and it works better than it has any right to. Your husband comes in while the smoke is still finding its way to the ceiling, and he does what he does every evening now, which is glance at the window and see that it is already done and say nothing about it. Then he sits down heavily and asks whether there is any of the wine left. The room is sealed. It will be warm tonight, warmer than is comfortable, and one of the children will complain, and you will say what your own mother said to you in exactly this room's equivalent 30 years ago, and in more or less the same words. The gauze hangs still over the bed. The clay dish burns down slowly. Outside, the last of the light goes off the top of the buildings opposite, and the swallows that have been turning over the courtyard all evening go wherever they go, and the lane below fills up with the sound of everyone who is not sleeping yet, because the closing of the shutters is not the closing of the day. Not in spring, not here. The day, in fact, is about to start again downstairs, in a different form, on chairs dragged out onto the paving. You go down at about 8 or a little after, because that is when the stairwell starts to sound like a stairwell again. Doors opening on 4 floors at once, somebody's chair being carried down sideways and knocking the wall at every landing. A woman calling to her sister 2 flights below to bring the small stool as well. Nobody agrees to this hour. Nobody announces it. The heat goes out of the stone, and the quarter comes outside, and that is all the arrangement there has ever been. The lane by then is arranged the way it is arranged every warm evening. Chairs against the wall on the side that lost the sun first. The older women take those, and they take them by a seniority nobody would ever write down, but everybody obeys. Younger women sit on the step or on an upturned crate with a child leaning on one knee. The men stand, mostly, in a loose knot at the corner where the lane meets the wider street. And they stand there for hours, and if you ask them afterward what was discussed, they will say nothing much, and this will be almost true. Your children are gone within a minute of the door opening. They will be somewhere in a running knot of 11 or 12 other children between here and the church, playing a game with rules that shift constantly and are enforced with enormous seriousness, and they will come back when they are hungry or when somebody is crying. You do not follow them. There are perhaps 40 adults between the 2 ends of this lane, and every one of them knows your children by sight, and several of them would take a switch to their own child for running into the road, but would simply seize yours by the collar and turn them around. And this is understood on all sides as the arrangement. It is the only childcare most of Rome has ever had. This is worth slowing down for, because the evening street is doing something that has no equivalent in the way we live now. It is not leisure exactly. A great deal of business is transacted on those chairs. Who has work coming, and who does not? Whose son might be taken on at the yard? Which landlord has raised what? which shop will extend credit past Saturday, and which has stopped. A woman with a room to let does not put a notice in a newspaper. She mentions it to 3 people between the fountain and the corner, and it is let by Thursday. The chairs are a labor exchange, a credit bureau, a marriage market, and a court of reputation. All of it running on nothing but proximity, and the fact that the rooms upstairs are too hot to sit in. Across the river, at the same hour, a different Rome is doing something that looks superficially similar, and is not the same at all. On the Corso, the shops keep their windows lit, and the pavement fills between 8 and 10, with people walking slowly in both directions. And the walking is the point. Government clerks, of whom the new capital had made many thousands, come out with their wives and their daughters, dressed a step above what their salaries comfortably allow, and they walk up, and then they walk back down. They stop where they are meant to stop. They greet people they intend to be seen greeting. A young woman on that pavement is being looked at by families with sons, and she knows it, and her mother certainly knows it. And the whole slow procession is a machine for arranging futures that is no less practical than the chairs in your lane, only better dressed and much less honest about its purpose. The cafes along the Corso and around the Piazza Colonna have tables out, and the men at them are reading newspapers past dark, which is itself a small marvel and a recent one. Rome had gas lighting in quantity by then, several thousand public lamps, lit each evening by men working a fixed route with a pole, and in the newer central streets, the first electric lamps had begun to appear, arc lights on the main thoroughfares that threw a hard blue-white glare, quite unlike the soft yellow everybody was used to. People went specifically to look at them. There were complaints that the light was ugly, that it made faces look ill, and there were also, immediately, shops that installed lit signs and stayed open later because of them. What the light did, more than anything, was redraw the map of where a respectable woman could be after dark. This is easy to miss. For most of Rome's history, the answer had been nowhere, alone, past a certain hour. A lit street with a tram on it and a policeman at the corner is a different proposition from an unlit lane, and so the hours of the city stretched. The theatres ran later, the cafes ran later. Families that would not have dreamed of an evening walk in 1860 took one in 1893 as a matter of course. And the whole idea of the evening as a time when ordinary people go out and are seen is very largely a creation of gaslight, and then electricity. The trams helped as much as the lamps. Rome had horse trams from the 1870s, running out along the main routes, and by the early 90s, the first electric lines were being laid and argued about. A tram fare was a small coin, not nothing to you, but not impossible either, and it meant that a family living out past the walls in one of the new blocks could come into the center for an evening and get home again without walking an hour in the dark. It meant, too, that the city stopped being a set of separate neighborhoods that each lived their own evening, and started unevenly to become one place with a shared one. Only unevenly, though. You do not go to the Corso. You could. It is a walk of perhaps 20 minutes, and it costs nothing to look in a shop window. But you would be looked at, and the looking would be quick and complete and entirely accurate, and you would come home with the specific tiredness that comes from having been priced by strangers. So, the Corso happens, and you know it happens, and it happens without you. And the lane happens, and the clerks' wives on the Corso would not be able to name a single street in your quarter. Tonight, though, is not an ordinary evening, because the festa is on. It is for the church at the end of the lane, and the occasion is a saint whose particulars half the quarter could not give you accurately if pressed. And none of that matters in the slightest. What matters is that somebody has strung paper lanterns across the lane from the second-floor windows, red and yellow, and one that is a color nobody can agree on. And there are candles in glass jars on the ledge outside the church door, and the whole lane has gone from something you walk through to something you are inside of. There is a stall. There is always a stall. A man with a pan of oil set over charcoal is frying things. Squares of dough, and cod in batter, and courgette flowers when he has them, and selling them in twists of paper for a few centesimi. And the smell of that oil is going to be in the plaster of these walls for a week. You buy 3 twists because you have 3 children, and there is no arithmetic in the world that would let you buy 2. The paper burns your fingers through. The dough is too hot to eat, and everybody eats it too hot anyway. There is a band, if that is the word, 6 or 7 men from the quarter, and 1 boy, brass mostly, and they play loudly and confidently, and not well, and they play the same 4 pieces in rotation for 2 hours, and at some point they play something everybody knows, and 40 people sing it at once, at slightly different speeds. Nobody is embarrassed. That is the striking thing, and it is worth saying plainly, because we have largely lost it. Nobody in that lane is embarrassed. The singing is bad and public and unashamed, and the dancing that starts near the stall at some point involves 2 women in their 60s and a great deal of laughing, and there is no audience, because everyone present is in it. You stand with your back against the wall of your own building, with a twist of paper in your hand. And the woman from the second floor comes and stands beside you, and the 2 of you watch the lane without saying much for a long while. She tells you her sister is coming from Frosinone in June. You tell her your husband's workshop has been quiet. Neither of you says anything about what quiet means. Then she says the frying man has put too much salt on everything this year, and you agree, and that is the whole conversation. And it took 20 minutes, and was worth having. The lanterns burn down unevenly. One catches slightly at around 11, and a man puts it out with a broom handle to general approval. And this is discussed for the rest of the night, as though it were an event. The children come back at some point, filthy, sticky to the elbow, arguing about a rule. The youngest has fallen asleep against a stranger's chair and has to be carried. That is the signal, and it moves down the lane in the way these things do. 1 family stands, and then 2, and then the chairs start going back inside, knocking the same walls on the way up that they knocked on the way down. The stairwell is dark. There is a lamp on the second landing that somebody is meant to see to, and nobody has. So you go up by memory, which is easy, because you have gone up these stairs several thousand times, and your feet know where the worn tread is on the 3rd flight. The building smells of everybody's supper at once. Somebody's onions, somebody's fish, the frying oil that has come up from the lane and got into the whole stairwell, and will not leave. Behind the doors you pass, other lives are ending their days at the same rate as yours. A man coughing, a woman saying something short and tired to somebody, a baby, briefly, then your own door, and the handle you know the exact stiffness of, and the room with its sealed shutters, and its smell of citronella and cold charcoal, still holding the heat of the whole day, like a hand closing. The children go down in stages, which is how they always go down. The eldest first, because she is old enough to want to be treated as though she is deciding it herself. And so you let her decide it, and she takes the good place near the wall without being told she may. The middle one takes longer, because he is at the age where sleep feels like something being taken from him rather than something offered. The youngest is already gone, carried up the stairs unconscious, and set down still in his day clothes, because the alternative is waking him to undress him. And no one in the history of this building has ever thought that was worth it. You get the sticky hands wiped with a rag and a little water. You get the shoes off. The rest can wait until morning. And there is one bed for the three of them, pushed against the wall that stays warmest, and one for you and your husband on the other side of the room, and between them a space of perhaps 4 feet where the table stands, and the chairs are pushed in, and the whole business of the day has happened. This arrangement is so ordinary that it takes an outsider to notice it. Everybody you know sleeps this way. The children of your own childhood slept this way. It is only in the newer buildings across the river, the ones going up with piped water and a room for each purpose, that anyone would think to describe a bedroom as a separate idea from a room. What a shared bed does, practically, is keep everybody warm without fuel. What it also does is make every cough and every fever and every bad dream a household event rather than a private one. And you have learned to sleep through a great deal because of it. You will wake instantly for the sound that matters and not at all for the sounds that do not. And no one taught you this distinction. You acquired it the way you acquired most things, by needing it. The lamp is the last real expense of the day. This is worth slowing down for, because the whole shape of a working household's evening comes down to the price of light. Oil for a small lamp, olive oil, or the cheaper mineral oil that the shops have been selling more of these last years, costs enough that you think about it. Not agonize. Think about it in the way you think about salt or thread. A candle costs more per hour of light than the lamp does, which is why candles are for the shrine on the landing, and for church, and for the night somebody is ill, and not for sewing by. So the arithmetic is simple, and it runs the whole year. Daylight is free. Lamplight is not. Therefore, everything that can be done by daylight is done by daylight, and the evening gets whatever is left over. And in December, when the light goes at 4:30, the evening gets almost everything, and the oil bill shows it. In June, you can string beads at the window until nearly 9, and spend nothing. You know, without ever having written it down, roughly what the difference is across a year. It is not a small number. It is the difference between a pair of boots being possible and not possible. This is why your people go to bed early and rise early, and it is not a moral quality, whatever the improving pamphlets say about the virtue of the early riser. It is a budget. Tonight the lamp is lit because there is a shirt to finish. Your husband's second shirt, the one that is not the good one, which has gone at the shoulder seam, where the strap of his tool bag has been riding for 2 years. You could have done it this afternoon, and you did not, because the piecework had to be counted, and the count had to be right. So it is now, by lamplight, at the table, with the wick turned to about half, because half is enough to see a seam by if you sit close, and if your eyes are still good. And yours are, mostly, though you have noticed this last year, that you tilt the work toward the light more than you used to. The seam takes 11 minutes. You know this because it always takes about 11 minutes, and you have done it, on one garment or another, several hundred times. Your husband is at the other chair, with his boots off and his feet flat on the tiles, which he says is the best part of the day, and which you believe, because his work is standing work, and has been since he was 14. He talks while you sew, not to you exactly, more into the room. The workshop is quiet, not stopped, quiet. 2 of the orders that were expected in April have not come, and the master has not said anything about it, which is itself the information. Your husband has been in that trade long enough to read a silence. Furniture is the first thing people stop buying, and the last thing they start again. And the building fever that filled the new quarters with apartments has gone cold. And apartments that stand empty do not need cabinets in them. He says there is talk of a fortnight of short weeks in the summer. He says talk, which means someone said it in a doorway, and someone else repeated it. Then he tells you about his cousin, which he has told you about twice this week, because it sits in him and will not settle. The cousin has gone, not to Rome, the way half of them went to Rome 20 years ago, when the ministries came and the building started, and everybody with a trowel or a hammer walked in from the countryside. Gone properly, Genoa, and then a ship, and then Buenos Aires, where there is an uncle of some kind who is said to have work and is said to have written, though nobody in the family has seen the letter. Whole villages have been doing this for a decade now. It is not new, and it is not rare, and everyone in this building knows a family it has happened to, and the shape is always the same. A young man goes, and then he sends money, and then either he sends for someone, or he stops writing. Both endings are common. Nobody says the second one out loud. Your husband is not going anywhere. He is 40, he has a trade, and a master who keeps him, and 3 children in a bed 4 feet away. But he turns the cousin over, the way you turn a coin over. And what he is really saying, in the way people say things at 11 at night, is that he has thought about what the winter looks like if the short weeks come. You say the sensible thing, which is that the short weeks are talk. You say it because it is true, and because it is what he needs to hear before he sleeps. And both of those can be reasons at once. You bite the thread. The seam is done and will hold, and it will hold because you have set it with a doubled stitch at the shoulder point where the strap rides, which no one will ever look at, and which is the difference between a shirt that lasts another year and one that goes again in 6 weeks. Then you square the day silently, the way you do every night, and it takes less than a minute because it is not really thinking. It is a kind of counting that runs underneath everything. what was spent, what is owed at the shop, and what the slate looks like, and how it will look on Saturday. What is left of the oil, the flour, the charcoal, whether the middle child's shoes will do until autumn, or whether they will not, where the money for the festa candles came from, and what it came out of. None of this is written. There is no ledger in this house. It lives entirely in your head, and it is accurate, and it has been accurate for 11 years of marriage. And if you were struck down tomorrow, no one else in this family could reconstruct it. Your husband knows what he earns. He does not know what bread costs this week, because he has never had to. The lamp goes down. You turn the wick with your thumb until the flame drops to nothing, and the room fills with that particular smell of a just extinguished lamp. And for a moment you cannot see anything at all, and then the shutters resolve themselves as lines of very faint grey, where the street lamp in the lane gets through the slats. Somewhere across the river, a clock strikes, and then a bell nearer answers it a half-minute late, because the bells of this city have never once agreed with each other, and no one expects them to. The building settles. A door 2 floors down. Cartwheels on the basalt. One cart, going somewhere at this hour for reasons of its own, now hold 2 things at the same time, because they are both true, and neither cancels the other. The first is that you are extraordinarily good at this. Not adequate. Good. You run a household of 5 on a fluctuating wage in a city where rents have outrun earnings for 20 years, and you do it with no oven. 1 window, cold water carried up 4 flights, and no machine of any kind except a needle and a pair of scissors. You know the price of 11 staple goods to the centesimo, and you can feel a bad artichoke through the leaves. You have kept 3 children alive through a fever season in a low quarter, which is not luck, or not only luck. You manage credit, labor, food, cloth, health, and the delicate diplomacy of a courtyard of women who must cooperate and must never be seen to owe each other too much. In any other arrangement, this would be called administration, and someone would be paid for it. The second is that not 1 line of it will be recorded anywhere. Your husband's trade is in a workshop register. His wage exists as a figure. Yours does not, because the beads you strung this afternoon were counted against a piecework rate that no census taker will ever ask you about. And because the rest of what you did today is not classified as work at all by anyone, including sometimes by you. If he stops earning, there is no arrangement that catches you. If you stop, there is no household. That asymmetry is not something you chose, and not something you can negotiate. It is the structure of the thing, and it was built long before you were born, and it will not be dismantled by you being excellent at your position within it. Both, at once. The skill is real, and the erasure is real, and they sit in the same room, 4 feet apart, like the 2 beds. The heat of the day is finally going out of the walls. The citronella has burned down to almost nothing. In the other bed, the middle child turns over and says 1 unintelligible word to no one, and is quiet again. Outside, the lane empties by degrees. A last chair scraping in. Someone laughing once, further off. The bells are done for the hour, and the next ones are a long way away. And the room goes dark, and the city goes down around you, and the water in the copper vessels by the door sits still and full for the morning.